Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. Teresa Avila, Chair of the Annual Conference Committee. It's my pleasure to begin this session. I will briefly tell you about the Annual Conference Committee, who hosts this session and nominates the Distinguished Scholar. We also are involved in reviewing ranked submissions to the conference. And I would like to take a moment now, if there's any members of the ACC committee, if you'd like to stand to be recognized for all your labor, I invite you to do that, please. Greg, I see you back there. Anyone else here? Yes. We work regularly all year long on many different matters that support the conference, but the submissions are our primary work. And that could not happen without the Council of Readers. So anyone here from the Council of Readers? Just like to acknowledge you. Council of Readers, yes, appreciate that work. The Council of Readers reads the submissions and is the first line of assessment. Each submission is read 3 times. So I would love to encourage everyone here, if you haven't done so in the past, to consider submitting to the conference. We're a member-driven organization. The conference is what we make it. And if you want to be represented, if you feel that you're missing, your field is not represented, you need to show up and submit. So I really encourage you to do that. It's my pleasure to be here with you and, as I said, start the session. But before I invite Laura Barbata up to the podium, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge 2 very key members of the ACC who support all of our work, Megan Donahue and Mira Friedlander. I'm sure you see their names on all communications. They're so crucial to this conference. They really make a lot happen. You would be surprised, all of their efforts. And before I turn over the podium, I would just like to give my own anecdote in relation to the Distinguished Scholar, who is a really significant scholar, somebody in my graduate school days who marked rigor, someone who we looked for, someone who really introduced innovative concepts about Latin American art, and we really sought out that knowledge. And so I'm really happy to be part of this session. I don't want to give up too much, so I will allow Laura Anderson Barbata, the VP of the annual conference, who is the final and crucial member of the annual conference committee, to come up and introduce the chair of this session. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes, buenas noches, good evening. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you all for being here. As VP of the College Art Association's annual conference and programs, I am delighted to stand before you to introduce Dr. Edward J. Sullivan, CAA's 2023 Distinguished Scholar. Now, if you will permit me, I would like to share with you my perspective, my experience as an artist, as a Mexican artist, and what this means to me. I first met Dr. Sullivan in Mexico City in the late 80s, when he was conducting research for his groundbreaking exhibition, Women in Mexico, La Mujer en Mexico. A major exhibition and publication that for the first time brought together the work of female artists from several generations. It included the works of established and deceased artists such as Frida Kahlo, Tina Modotti, Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, Olga Costa, Maria Izquierdo, Lilia Carrillo, Lola Alvarez Bravo, and younger at the time, artists, contemporary artists such as Elena Clement, Graciela Iturbide, Flor Garduño, Magali Lara, and more, myself included. Artists who were well known in Mexico, but virtually unknown outside of our own country. The exhibition opened in 1990 at the National Academy of Design in New York and traveled extensively. Now, due to the limited amount of time we have tonight, I won't go into all the iterations of the exhibition and publication, but I feel it's very important to mention that at the time, there was little interest from the north of the work of artists south of the border, other than perhaps Frida Kahlo and the muralists, of course. For us, women and LGBTQIA+ contemporary artists, it was extremely difficult to garner any interest from museums, galleries, curators, critics, historians, or collectors outside of our own country. Dr. Sullivan had lived and studied in Mexico City in his youth. He was fluent in Spanish. He was familiar with our traditions, customs, language, culture, and our history. His interest and respect for our culture was evident. He saw us, and he earned the respect of artists and institutions in Mexico because he presented the work from our perspective. Because Dr. Sullivan's extensive body of work, Women in Mexico, La Mujer en Mexico, exhibition and catalog are but only one of his many accomplishments. And sometimes it isn't even in his CV. But for us, it was transformative. His attention expanded to include the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, with focus on the work of women, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA+ artists from these geographies. His work is a form of activism. 35 years ago, Dr. Sullivan's scholarship and curatorial work opened doors for many of us from Latin America and the Caribbean. We are being seen today, written about, studied, and recognized not only by a historian the stature of Dr. Sullivan, but by others as well. And our work included in exhibitions and academic publications outside of our local circuits. A lot changed for us. Dr. Sullivan's work has been transformative, especially in relation to the study and elevation of Latin American, Caribbean, Latina, Latino, Latinx art and artists, and for the advancement of women and BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ communities in these regions. Dr. Edward Sullivan, muchas gracias. Now, let us welcome Lynda Klich. Did I pronounce that correctly?
It's okay, close enough.
I'm sorry. Associate Professor at Hunter College, CUNY, CUNY, who is chairing this panel. It's an honor to be here and an honor to have you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. In November of 1941, in the very first issue of Art Journal, the art historian Elizabeth Wilder noted the dearth of scholarship in the field of Latin American art and issued an urgent call for pioneers. How, Wilder demanded, can anyone ask that baffling and important question, whether there is an American spirit in art, without a glance at the other Americas? Wilder's appeal met a vastly different fate than the one found in the essay that immediately preceded it in the same issue, in which Alfred Barr similarly challenged scholars to address the new field of 20th century art and painters like Picasso and Matisse in a text called Modern Art Makes History Too. Of course, these two challenges played out very differently, and decades later, Wilder's call remained urgent amidst the background of civil rights battles, identity politics, and the essential and continuing need to have academia reflect changing national demographics. Today, we honor the groundbreaking career of Edward Sullivan, who in the mid-'80s resoundingly became the pioneer that Wilder sought. Since then, Edward has remained at the forefront of the field of Latin American art, attuned to its explosive growth, keeping abreast of its evolving methodologies, and always an unflagging advancer of this dynamic and continually changing field. It is indeed impossible to encapsulate such a long and distinguished career in several minutes. So I begin with the awe-inspiring exercise of Edward Sullivan by the numbers. 27 books and exhibition catalogs, tens of exhibitions curated, dozens of book chapters, and hundreds of lectures on national and international stages, and counting in all of these categories. Edward's scholarly corpus spans the 17th to the 21st centuries, and as you see on this map, traverses continents and hemispheres, reaching at least 30 different countries, not to mention the multiple locations within each. But Edward's scholarship is not just about sheer numbers and impressive reach, or mere pins on the world map. Rather, his many books, edited volumes, articles, lectures, and exhibitions represent the insightful and purposeful intellectual structuring of the field of Latin American art. Through his steadfast scholarly contributions, Edward has shaped, carved, and guided this field in ways that proved both pioneering and prescient. With the same kind of broad inclusivity and attention to marginalization as Lynda outlined, Edward insisted on a paradigm that included the Latinx and the Caribbean within the rubric of Latin American academia, and embraced the Francophone and Anglophone, as well as the Lusophone and Hispanophone Americas. As the field has expanded and grown, its parameters have been consistently debated in both academic and curatorial circles. The model Edward has insisted upon since the 1980s, steadfastly and with messianic verve, has proven influential and enduring. While mapping out the field he has pioneered, Edward has also insistently refused to stand still intellectually, continually pushing his own boundaries as he expanded those of the field. At the heart of Edward's work, begun as a characteristically object-oriented graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, is careful monographic attention to individual artistic production, starting with work on the Spanish Baroque painter Claudio Coello and his earliest explorations of Latin American artists such as Claudio Bravo, Fernando Botero, and Julio Larraz, and continuing throughout his career, including more recent studies of Francisco Oller and Roberto Burle Marx. Building an encyclopedic knowledge of Latin American artistic production, Edward moves easily through readings of paintings and photographs and installations to analyses of architecture, gardens, and urban design. In so doing, he pushes traditional genre definitions of landscape, still life, and portraiture, and challenges understandings of figuration and abstraction. Edward has compiled this scholarly corpus with keen attention to the ever-growing field, situating himself at its forefront and speaking to his astute awareness of its changes, moving from discussions of national identity to internationalism, from center-periphery relations to globalism, transnationalism, and hemispheric networks, opening the canon to female and queer production, and centering Indigenous and Black creators. Edward's early recognition of curating as an essential form of knowledge production for a young and growing field cannot be underestimated. His exhibitions and catalogs became key vehicles, not only for scholarship, but also for bringing awareness to this long marginalized field. Who can forget the splash made by the dramatic staging of the Retablo de San Bento de Olinda against the spirals of Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum? In other words, if the numbers impress, it's what's behind them resonates. Even though this session focuses on Edward's scholarship, it must be noted that his impressive achievements top his decades as an exemplary citizen in the field around the world, and as a dedicated and beloved teacher and mentor to countless students, from undergraduates to PhDs, also around the world. 4 of his PhD students present their work here today, in studies that at once recognize Edward's groundbreaking scholarship and point to its influence and reach. The talks, while focusing on distinct subjects and demonstrating diverse methodologies, bring to the fore the multifaceted nature of Edward's influence, with its intersecting threads of connoisseurship, curating, educating, and innovating. The speakers include IIona Katzew, Department Head and Curator of Latin American Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and Edward's first PhD student. Estrellita B. Brodsky, Independent Scholar, Curator, and founder of Another Space in New York. Sean Nesselrode Moncada, Associate Professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. And Joseph Shaikewitz, PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts, and Edward's final PhD student. Before I pass the podium to our first speaker, I close by saying that it is a personal honor to introduce this session, marking the distinguished career of Edward J. Sullivan. It has long been a privilege to learn from Edward, from even before I knew him, when I was an aspiring art historian reading his work and visiting his exhibitions, to when I was his PhD student at the IFA, and continuing until today as his colleague. Anyone who knows him is in awe of his tireless energy and grateful for his generosity, and fully cognizant that the body of work produced by his never-ending intellectual curiosity, and that we honor here today, has been a sincere labor of love. Edward Sullivan is a distinguished scholar, to be sure, but he's also an excellent human being. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Edward. It's such a pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here today to celebrate Edward Sullivan's Distinguished Scholar Award. Edward has mentored and inspired generations of students, as you can see from the cross-section of today's presenters, and has remained a vital source of support and inspiration for so many of us as we have gone to build our own careers. A pioneer in the field, when I first arrived in New York City in the early 1990s, and I'm dating myself, Edward was about the only game in town teaching Latin American art. At NYU, he offered courses ranging from modern Mexican, Latin American, and Caribbean art. For those of us of Latin American or Latino background, he created a space where our own culture was valued and studied on the same level as the more standard offerings of art history at the time. In the process, he helped create and validate an entire field and give visibility to artists and histories seldom taught anywhere. Edward traveled incessantly throughout Latin America. As a young graduate student, I happily tagged on as the exhibition coordinator of one of his shows at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Santiago in Chile. I don't know if you remember that, Edward, but I do. He was always bringing back suitcases brimming with books that he eagerly shared with his students, and we looked forward with anticipation to combing through his library after every trip. A gifted and empathic teacher, Edward's curiosity is boundless. He's constantly striving to learn something new and has been exceptionally receptive to what his students consider worth turning their attention to. His openness, generosity, and unconditional support has been a gift to many of us as we found our way through the maze of our discipline. Those of you who know Edward are aware that he has had a parallel career as a prolific curator. Working with artists and real objects has been a continual source of joy for Edward, who has a deep understanding of how academia and curatorial work are profoundly intertwined. Perhaps this is why so many of his students have taken up jobs as curators, established exhibition spaces, and Estrellita's another space here is a brilliant example of that, or have taught directly with artists and objects. I know many of you gathered here today know this to be true of the Edward experience. For today's panel, I thought I'd honor Edward through one painting, which I recently acquired for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It not only happens to be a work by perhaps my favorite 18th century New Spanish painter, Juan Patricio Morlete Ruiz, but what makes it especially meaningful is that it was Edward who, knowing of my long-standing interest in the field, and the artist in particular, led me to this picture in a private collection in Italy. Morlete Ruiz was one of the most important artists of his generation. Although his fame has been largely overshadowed by Miguel Cabrera, he was a highly refined and methodical artist. At the age of 16, Morlete moved from his native San Miguel de Allende in Guanajuato to Mexico City. where he apprenticed with the celebrated mulatto painter José de Ibarra. There he became part of a highly educated group of painters involved in the establishment of an informal academy of painting in the 1750s, and then again in 1768. His great versatility contributed to his rapid ascent and his association with several viceroys. As expected, he fulfilled numerous commissions for religious orders, but also excelled in the depiction of secular subjects, such as this magnificent still life or bodegón of Mexico's local flora and fauna, which was recently acquired by the Museo de América in Madrid. Casta paintings, and these are 3 examples in LACMA's collections, and portraits of notable individuals, including the splendid work known as Man with Clocks, which I recently argued is a likeness of the Spanish royal bureaucrat Francisco Leandro de Viana, known as the Count or Conde de Tepa. A highly interesting body of paintings are his copies after fashionable French works. He painted over 24 views of the ports of France after Claude-Joseph Vernet, known through prints by Charles-Nicolas Cochin and Jacques-Philippe Lebas. The works you see on the screen, also from LACMA's collection, belong to one of 2 sets completed between 1769 and 1772, the year of Morlete's death. They are no doubt among the best viceregal landscapes ever created in Mexico. In 1767, Morlete also signed and dated 2 series of paintings of the battles of Alexander the Great. A complete set of 6 canvases is in a private collection in Mexico City, while 3 pictures, including LACMA's newly acquired painting, are known from a second set. The works, which are distinguished by their brilliant coloring and complex spatial treatment, are based on a suite of prints after paintings by Charles Lebrun. During the reign of Louis XIV, Lebrun controlled most official artistic production in France. This period of efflorescence was marked by the establishment of local manufactories and royal art academies, including those dedicated to painting and sculpture, dance, music, and architecture. The goal of these institutions was to glorify the image of the Sun King, as Louis XIV was known, and to disseminate the achievements of the French court. Lebrun played a pivotal role in the establishment and reform of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris and was named first painter of the king in 1664. Between 1661 and 1673, he created a set of 5 monumental history paintings known as the Battles of Alexander, which he considered his greatest accomplishment. The subject was royal magnanimity, an apt metaphor for the reign of Louis XIV, who identified with a famous Macedonian ruler from antiquity. And I'm showing here a couple of paintings from the famous set. The state recognized the propaganda value of the Alexander series, and tapestries and prints were made after it and sent as gifts to rulers and dignitaries across Europe. As director of the Gobelins Royal Manufactory in Paris, Lebrun oversaw the weaving of tapestries from the 1660s to the 1680s. He also selected the two most prominent printmakers of their generation, Gerard Audran and Gerard Edelinck, to create reproductive prints after his compositions. And Edelinck rendered Queens of Persia at the feet of Alexander, and Audran produced the other 4 scenes of the set that include Crossing of the Granicus, Battle of Arabella, Triumphal Entry into Babylon, and Alexander and Porus. Pulled from 15 separate copper plates, the colossal images were incorporated into a notable multi-volume print collection known as the Cabinet du Roi. Celebrated for their technique and expressive power, Audran and Edelinck's works became the most critically acclaimed of the set, to the point of overshadowing Lebrun's paintings. Lebrun, however, was fully aware of the power of reproductive prints to spread his reputation internationally, and in 1656, he obtained a royal privilege that gave him full authority to choose who could or who could not copy his designs. Audran, the Alexander suite became enormously popular almost immediately after it was completed, and demand for the images remained high throughout the 18th century. After Lebrun's death, several trade copies were produced in a variety of sizes, while outside France, copies were published even earlier. And on the screen, you see 2 later copies by Jean Audran, which were significantly smaller. And here, I also just want to give a shout out to Louis Marquesano's recently work on this prints, which has been really path-breaking and really helped build subsequent arguments for all of us. In 1717, a 6th image was added to the set, Porous in Battle, by the French printmaker and publisher Bernard Picard, which also matched Audran's and Edeling's prints in terms of scale and was also copied by other printmakers. Given that one of Morlette's set, and likely also the second incomplete one, had 6 scenes, including Porous in Battle, and that his description of the triumphal entry into Babylon presents the original printed image in reverse orientation, it is likely that he had access to one or more of the later suites, such as the print by Jean Audran that you see here. There is ample evidence of the circulation of the Alexander prints in New Spain. As early as 1719-20, Juan Rodriguez Juarez referenced the central figure in Porous in Battle, with his back to the viewer, to portray the muscular treasure chest-wielding soldier in his adoration of the kings, painted at the behest of Viceroy Baltasar de Zúñiga y Guzmán, Marqués de Valero, for the main altarpiece of Mexico City's cathedral. This illusionistic work was one of the artist's most consummate masterpieces. By referencing the last battle scene engraved in 1717 by Picard, Rodriguez Juarez demonstrated his awareness of the most important artistic novelties of the time. Along with other artists from his circle, he had established an informal painting academy by 1722 and undertook the reform of painting. It stands to reason that as one of the most notable artists of his generation, Rodriguez Juarez owned several prints from the set, which were presumably passed down to his disciples and followers, including Ibarra and Morlete. In the 1750s, several artists drew from the image's rich figural repertoire to render different compositions, a subject that has also been notably addressed by my dear colleague Paula Muesorts. At the time of his death, Cabrera owned a suite of 8 framed prints of Alexander, and he also possessed a set of 5 canvases of the history of Alexander, 3 on stretchers and 2 loose, which could refer to paintings by his own hand, Morlete, or an unknown artist. In his Diálogo de la Historia de la Pintura en México of 1860-61, José Bernardo Couto, the former president of the board of directors of the Academy of San Carlos, also mentioned a series of small paintings of the history of Alexander by Nicolás Enríquez, which suggests that the subject was taken up by several artists in Cabrera and Morlete Ruiz's immediate circle. And here I'm showing you another painting in LACMA's collection by Nicolás Enríquez, where you can see that he clearly borrowed the figure of the treasure-wielding figure from Rodriguez Juarez's work, which in turn is based on the Picard print. And here you see the works by Rodriguez Juarez, Enríquez, and Morlete together. And this is a recent installation shot from LACMA's Traveling Exhibition Archive of the World, where I was able to juxtapose the 2 paintings with the original print by Picard in the Getty collection, just to give you a better sense of scale and the interplay of these images. That the set was important within the context of academic training is also attested to by their presence in the probat inventory of Jerónimo Antonio Gil, the Spanish engraver who came to Mexico City in 1778 and founded the Royal Academy of San Carlos in 1783. So why does this matter? Morlete's 2 sets of the subject hold special interest in part for what they reveal about the working methods of New Spanish painters and their engagement with a range of French academic imagery prior to the official formation of the Academy of San Carlos. It seems logical to assume that because artists shared sources, they also engaged in discussions about how to translate black and white prints into color, especially within the context of academic gatherings. Additionally, it was widely accepted that the most challenging subject to paint was a battle scene, as it proved the proficiency and skill of the painter. In his paintings, Morlete Ruiz oscillated between adhering fairly closely to the original source material, attesting to his acute power of observation, and making subtle modifications to some of the compositions, including expanding the edges to accommodate more figures and landscape elements. In Triumphal Entry into Babylon, for example, he added on the far right the figure riding a white horse and looking out at the viewer, adapted from that in Alexandrian Porous. While on the far left, he added the group of women on a balcony pointing at the scene, as well as two children standing next to a column who also gesture towards the unfolding spectacle, and a young boy who has climbed up the column and takes in the scene from a distance. Another noticeable change is how Morlete untangled some of the stacked figures in the printed source to lend his compositions greater legibility. This is most evident in the far left, where the lyre and flute players, as well as the horse and the trumpet players before the elephant, are fully visible, which is not the case in the print. The addition of these figures to the work marking the triumphal entrance of Alexander, the culminating point of the story, is not random. Aside from reinforcing its moralizing message, it also proves Morlete's mastery by creating a novel and harmonious arrangement of one of the period's most canonical academic images. How Morlete Ruiz transferred the smaller designs of the print to the larger canvas is not entirely understood. While he might have used a grid to transfer the design square by square, the level of accuracy present in the LACMA picture also opens the possibility that he was among the first new Spanish painters to use a camera obscura or have access to other optical devices. Here, the putti placed on the stone plinth flanking the scroll cartouches create a striking trompe-l'oeil effect. Absent in the printed source, this detail along the stone ledge demarcates the space in a particularly original way, as if implying that what lies behind is a product of a double form of artifice, that of the original European painting that served as a model via print, which is here dexterously copied by a new Spanish master and proudly staged for display. In other words, Morlete Ruiz carefully organized the scene as a painting within a painting to emphasize his pictorial talent and position himself in relation to a transatlantic community of artists with shared intellectual interest. Morlete's sets of the Battle of Alexander clearly embody the academic pursuits of new Spanish painters going back to the generation of Rodriguez Juarez, and ultimately the internationalization of artistic taste of which they fully partook. Commenting on the pervasiveness of replicas, the Sienese polymath Giulio Mancini noted that a copy was preferable when painted so dexterously that it tricked the viewer, as it then contained the art of two artists. Although there are virtually no extant theoretical texts by 18th century New Spanish painters, they were certainly attentive to Spanish, Italian, and French artistic treatises, as well as to other theoretical works. And it is not difficult to imagine that Morlete was attuned to similar notions about the value of copies and emulation. The idea itself of emulation cum admiration was even codified in the Spanish Diccionario de Autoridades of 1726, in which an emulator is defined as, quote, one who with dignity imitates, competes with, and follows the footsteps of the virtuous, end of quote. As you can see, to wrap it up, a painting that may appear to be a straightforward copy is often much more, and can offer powerful visual commentary on the creative process of local painters. As curators and scholars, we are privileged to engage in these exercises of slow looking. For this particular new toy, and for much more, I have Edward to thank. Thank you, Edward.
I like to think of this well-known map by Torres Garcia as symbolic of Edward J. Sullivan's impeccable and scholarly dedication to refocusing our attention on the art of Latin America and Latino artists from South and Central America, the Caribbean, and the United States. In so doing, he has not only changed the perspective of academics, but also that of an international general public. Without a doubt, the name Edward Sullivan is synonymous with art scholarship in the field of modern and contemporary Latin American and Caribbean art. Today, I will discuss how Edward's curatorial scholarship has directly affected my own work. But first, I would like to talk about how my personal friendship and close professional respect for Edward has evolved over the past 25 years. I first met Edward in 1998 while working with Fatima Berg on the exhibition Taino, Pre-Columbian People of the Caribbean, and then serving as co-chair of the Board of Trustees at El Museo del Barrio. At the time, Edward was an enthusiastic and generous member of the Museo's Advisory Committee. It's fair to say that an exhibition and mutual passion for the arts of the Caribbean and Latin America is what brought us together. It's also fair to say that despite my family roots in Venezuela and Uruguay, I would not have pursued my subsequent studies or activism in the field had it not been for Edward's encouragement, inspiration, and support. Having received an MA from Hunter and written my thesis on the male figure of the work of French Impressionist painter Gustave Caillebotte, it was only thanks to Edward's enthusiasm that I had the impetus and courage, frankly, took a lot of courage, to apply to the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU's PhD program, and to specialize in Latin American art. I might also mention, as an aside, that Edward, it seems, has taught at NYU, and please correct me if I'm wrong, since 1979 or early 1980? For over 50 years, a half a century? Clearly, Edward, looking at you today, you must have started at the age of 5. But through my coursework and subsequent PhD research in the field, I expanded my knowledge and interest in Latin America with many of Edward's eye-opening courses that responded to my own belief that art history should take a transnational approach, exploring the ways in which artists actually work and think across national borders and cultural divides. Among these courses were Modernism in 4 Latin American cities: Mexico City, Havana, Rio, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, as well as the visual culture in the Caribbean, the arts of Brazil, to name just a few. And of course, these courses were reinforced by the many, 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 many publications that Edward has written and edited, such as the groundbreaking Latin American art of the 20th century, the first comprehensive survey of the subject that has served past and future generations of Latin Americanists as the go-to anthology. It was the inspiration of Edward as the quintessential scholar-curator that I wish to speak to today. Following Edward's example, I was able to use the information gathered through my studies and dissertation to create a series of exhibitions on the achievements of a generation of artists from Latin America who established themselves in post-World War II Paris. As a scholar-curator, Edward has organized numerous groundbreaking exhibitions that many have mentioned here, but that broke Latin American and Caribbean art out of the academic silos and onto the radar of broader international audiences. I will name just a few of these that have resonated with my own research and curatorial approach of giving access to works seldom if ever seen by U.S. public that is too often unaware of the richness of our cross-cultural traditions and achievements. Edward's exhibition, Brazil, Body and Soul, featured artworks from Brazil's Baroque and modern periods, revealing ideas about the sensorial and the spiritual that had shaped Brazilian art over 4 centuries. It's amazing that the exhibition drew upon religious, secular, indigenous, Afro-Brazilian, modern, and contemporary art, a scope that today we're more familiar with, but at the time, it was hard to forget that extraordinary, enormous centerpiece imported from Brazil, reconstructed and installed inside the Guggenheim's iconic rotunda, a towering 5-story 18th century altar from Pernambuco. An incredible feat of diplomacy and breadth of scholarship. The exhibition included artists often showing at this scale for the first time in the United States, including Ligia Clark, Elio Tisica, Tarsilo do Amaral, and Tunga, to name just a few. Edward's show at the America Society, observed Milagros de la Torre was the first monographic show of the Peruvian-American artist and featured over 40 object-based photographic works that examine issues related to violence, memory, and identity as a socio-political construct in order to critique government violence and surveillance. Edward has never been one to shy away from more difficult subjects, and in so doing, he highlighted the ways that trauma, both physical and emotional, manifest themselves across Milagros' practice and the archives she mines. And of course, Edward's interest in the Caribbean has been a constant throughout his teaching and curatorial practice. We all welcome the opportunity to see Impressionism in the Caribbean, Francisco Oller and his transatlantic world, that traced the career of Puerto Rican painter Francisco Oller across the Atlantic and between Europe and the Caribbean. Taking a transcontinental approach was integral to my future work. The exhibition highlighted the influence of European movements as Oller developed his own unique modernist style, synthesizing realism and impressionism, and revolutionized painting on the island. Needless to say, we were also thrilled to finally see Oller's iconic Velorio, a monumental painting that we had only seen in 3x4 slide presentations that was actually not stamp size, but rather a commanding 9 feet by 15 feet. But throughout these 3 exhibitions, to name only a handful of the many, many exhibitions he has curated, Edward's scholarship and dedication was and still is palpable and inspiring. It has heartened me to similarly advocate for the works by artists from Latin America and its diaspora within a global international perspective while valuing the local context from which each came. It was Edward who encouraged me to focus my dissertation on artists living in Paris after World War II rather than the earlier period between the wars that had already been studied. With the research and countless interviews I conducted with artists living in Paris, I was able to organize a series of exhibitions through which I sought to give greater presence to the critical contributions they had made. With Edward's encouragement, I organized Carlos Cruzies, Informed by Color, at the American Society. Amazingly, it was the first solo show in a U.S. cultural institution to present Cruzies as a major figure in the development of op and kinetic art in Europe as well as Latin America. The exhibition explored the artist's radical approach to activating color as a participatory act. Informed featured Cromosaturación, a light installation initially conceived by Cruzies in 1965, as well as his innovative early Fisichromias. Unlike artists such as Mark Rothko and James Turrell, who are well known for works that employ color as contemplative experiences, Cruzies took a different approach to color that prioritized the viewer's active engagement with color as a democratic act through movement and immersive experiences pushing the boundaries of art into everyday life as constantly changing and liberating. Further building on my dissertation research, I organized Soto, Paris and Beyond, 1950 to 1970 at the Gray Gallery, Museum of NYU. And I must say, looking at this audience, it does feel like a family. And I see so many familiar faces, including Lynn Gumpert and Sean, who worked on this exhibition, and Deborah Cullen, and they're too numerous to mention, but it is a community that has circled around Edward as our central star. But I organized this exhibition that focused on Venezuelan-born artist Jesus Soto as a key figure of the Paris avant-garde from 1950s on. Born a century ago in Ciudad Bolívar, he was widely recognized in Europe and Latin America for his pioneering kinetic innovations, but far less known in the United States. Taking a page from Edward's approach, I looked at Soto's work from both a local and international perspective. I underscored that his utopian concept of an art for the people was well established before his move to Paris as a direct result of his Venezuelan experiences as an extremely poor child who then benefited from newly liberalized arts programs in mid-1940s Caracas. I also wish to recognize the importance of the transnational exchanges between possible in World War II Paris, where Soto became an active and influential member of the avant-garde. In a way similar to Edward Oyer's exhibition, the show reflected upon the interconnectedness among artists that included Soto's interaction with those in Paris, such as the Latin American artists of the Mahdi, as well as with the international artists of Group Zero and the New Realists. At the Paris Museum, I presented the first U.S. museum survey of Argentine artist Julio Leparc, Form into Action. I presented a retrospective survey of Leparc's wide-ranging practice since his move to Paris in 1958 up to the present, and an examination of his impact on his contemporaries within both the Latin American and European post-war avant-garde and subsequent generations of international artists. It was a long overdue exploration of Leparc's pioneering role in 20th century art history as a major figure whose innovations in the fields of light, movement, and perception were critical to the aesthetic theories of interaction and spectatorship. And I must say it was very heartwarming because we welcomed over 140,000 visitors in just over 3 months. Most recently, my activities at my nonprofit gallery called Another Space continue to reflect a mission and scholarship closely related to Edward's curatorial approach. Established 8 years ago in 2015, Another Space's mission is to broaden awareness and appreciation of works by artists from Latin America and its diaspora within a global context while respecting their local origins. With a collaborative spirit and often taking on difficult subjects, the shows are curated in-house or by guest curators. This first exhibition was curated by Clara Kim on the prolific career of Paulo Brodsky, where he lives, from Recife, Brazil, where he lives and works. And I think it was an appropriate introduction to the space since Brodsky is a Brazilian artist known for his involvement with international male art movements and extensive Fluxus archives. One of the advantages of being a small organization is that we've been able to be reactive to current events or recent exhibition, as with the Second Sex, in which we showcased a selection of works by over 20 Latin and Latino women artists from different regions and generations. The exhibition was a response to the Brooklyn Museum's concurrent exhibition curated by Cecilia Fajardo Hill and Andrea Junta, Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960 to 1985, that presented the work of women artists and collectives during a key period in Latin American history. We were able to further collaborate with that exhibition by hosting the film of a series of interviews by the artists with each other. This is another collaborative performance work that we hosted with Marta Minujín from the original performance was from 1977, Arte Agrícola en Acción. Like Edward, at Another Space, I've also taken on topical and oftentimes difficult subjects, as with the timely exhibition Staying Alive, an exhibition about survival and resistance, including works by Alexander von Humboldt, as well as those by modern and contemporary artists. A similarly topical and more difficult issue was the exhibition Comfortably Numb, a critical investigation into the cultural impact of drugs and narcotics, showcasing works of over 20 artists from Latin America and the United States. We included pre-Columbian artifacts and drug-related ephemera. The exhibition examined the pervasive presence of drugs in the daily lives of the Americas and their impact on social and economic relations throughout the continents. We also collaborated with the Hemispheric Institute and presented Regina Galindo's powerful performance, Carrier Dead. It has been very validating that we are working with the Brodsky Museum in New Paltz to develop an expanded version of the show that will open in September of this year. Other shows included Pan y Circo, Appease, Distract, and Disrupt as a reaction to the 2020 elections. Elsewhere's Other Worlds, Other Times, Other Territories, an exploration of otherworldliness, co-curated by myself with Jose Falcone, who was more of the circus, which I love, that flea circus. We brought together works by over 25 artists from Latin America and its diaspora from the 9th century BCE to the present, grouped around themes of cosmology, magic, and non-Western forms of knowledge. Elsewhere sought to reflect on the role of artists and their potential to envision alternate societies as utopian or reclaimed territories. A timely exhibition, guest curated by independent curator and art historian Cecilia Fajardo Hill, Absence Presence, Latinx and Latin American Artists in Dialogue, examined the dynamics of exclusion and violence affecting Latinx and Latin American artists. And presently on view is Macho, representing masculinity, a group show that explores constructs of the masculine code, conceived as a sequel to Another Space's 2018, The Sex and Sex, studying the role of radical and feminist art practices in Latin America. Macho considers the way in which artists have questioned male identity as an absolute, whether through portraiture, self-portraiture, humor, or pathos. The show brings together works by over 25 multi-generational artists from Latin America and its diaspora, the Caribbean, and the United States from the 1940s until the present. In closing, throughout these exhibitions, I have held Edward as a role model to look up to and appreciate for his creativity as well as advice. A mentor, professor, then a colleague, and most importantly, a generous friend who is always encouraging not only myself, but generations of students and new audiences through talks and symposias. This is our version of the incredible series of talks that Edward has hosted at the Institute, and collaborating with artists, students, interns. Oh, Isabel, you are there. We have collaborated with artists, students, interns, welcoming school groups, including graduate and undergraduate students and peer groups from different interest bases, museums, and collectors. And today, I'm most grateful to the CAA for giving me this opportunity to acknowledge Edward's scholarship as a driving force for myself and countless others. I'm particularly honored to be a small part of this event, honoring as a distinguished scholar my most deserving dear friend and fearless leader, Edward J. Sullivan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a privilege to be here amongst colleagues and friends, and it is a tremendous honor to be given the opportunity to speak about the work and impact of Edward Sullivan. His scholarship and teaching have been instrumental for the field, for a generation of scholars, and for me both personally and professionally. Before I begin, I would like to outline the challenge that this particular assignment presents. It's not at all difficult to speak to Edward's importance. The difficulty lies in editing one's praise. Put simply and axiomatically, the field of Latin American and Latinx art history as we know it would not exist without him. That is an enormous claim, yes, but it is one that is indisputable. One need only glance at a list of the books written, volumes edited, catalog essays published, reviews submitted, and exhibitions curated to gain a sense of how prolific he has been over the past decades. From Roberto Burle Marx to Milagros de la Torre, Juan Soriano to Edouard de Valcarrier, Edward has covered the map. And because of those efforts, Latin American and Latinx art history are no longer the marginal fields that they were at the turn of the last century. They are now firmly ensconced within a broader and much more complex narrative. Edward has been and continues to be a champion of art that has gone underseen, undervalued, and underacknowledged in this country. And in that respect, it is important to consider the terms of his advocacy, the methodological and the ethical force of his work. Throughout his career, he has relentlessly questioned the geographic and the cultural limits of so-called Latin America, a term that he has declared, quote, a highly problematic, contested, and insufficient term to define its geographical reach, end quote. And yet it is one that was formed in the crucible of colonial contact and conquest. He is someone who considers New York a Latin American city, it is, who is equally at home discussing the syncretic material culture and vexed racial politics of colonial New Spain, as he is analyzing the politicized conceptualism of the Southern Cone in the latter 20th century. There is a capaciousness to Edward's scope and methodology that is staggering. Today, I would like to focus on one of the most sustained and fruitful investigations of his career. That is, his recovery and his advocacy of the work of the Puerto Rican realist impressionist artist Francisco Manuel Oller y Sestero. Edward's research on Oller encapsulates the defining features of his scholarship, his sensitivity to the politics of representation, his attention to local as well as transnational contexts, and his investment in pedagogy as an ethical imperative. Francisco Oller is perhaps the most prominent and celebrated Caribbean artist of the 19th century, but for too long he was overshadowed by European contemporaries such as Camille Pissarro and Paul Cézanne, with whom he is often placed in conversation but in a subordinate peripheral role, at least until Edward wrote about him. Here we see one of the most outstanding examples of Oller's many still lifes of tropical vegetation, Naturaleza Muerta con Cocos, from circa 1893. Now, many of us in this room are familiar with this painting directly because of Edward's dexterous reading of it in his 2014 monograph, From San Juan to Paris and Back, Francisco Oller and Caribbean Art in the Era of Impressionism. Describing the sensuous forms of the coconuts, he writes that, quote, there is a centrifugal force to this painting. Oller paints a dark void at the center of the canvas, a circular motion enhanced by the roundness of the coconuts, and it is reiterated at the extreme left by the bulbous forms of the stems that extend beyond the confines of our field of vision at the right. It is a beautiful passage, evocative and enlightening in its attentiveness, but Edward then draws our attention to the regional importance of the coconut as a symbol, of local sustenance, of the tropics as a location and an imaginary, of ecological transculturation. The coconut, like the plantain that features prominently in other still lifes, is not native to the Caribbean, yet it has become a visual and material shorthand for the archipelago. As Edward notes, Oller's painting represents an effort to define the telluric features of an island on the brink of political convulsion, in the form of the Spanish-American War that resulted in the neo-colonial acquisition of Puerto Rico by the United States as an unincorporated territory, a status which persists to this day. It is essentially a portrait of the island, and so it is fitting that the painting was paired with a late self-portrait of the artist at the entrance to the landmark retrospective exhibition, Impressionism and the Caribbean, Francisco Oller and His Transatlantic World, co-curated by Edward for the Brooklyn Museum. The show reunited over 80 works by Oller, situating him firmly within an international array of both contemporaries and predecessors. For many of us here, it was a revelation, and Estrellita attested to that just now. And Edward's reading of the coconut still life exemplifies his broader approach to Oller, both in the written word and in the gallery space. He zeroes in on the diplomatic and syncretic valences of these seemingly innocent fruits. And although he places the painting within a longer lineage of still life, from Francisco de Zurbarán to Albert Eckhout, he never loses sight of the artist himself or the work itself. Such a layered reading of the work advances several claims, and the first of these is actually delivered not in the 2014 Oller monograph, but in the earlier paradigmatic text, The Language of Objects in the Art of the Americas, from 2007. Here, the Oller still lifes make a brief appearance in a chapter on naturalezas vivas, a term that Edward uses to signal how such depictions, in his words, embody meaning within the realm of the senses, speaking in nuanced tones to the realities that directly touch the lives of those whose gaze meets them, end quote. The language of objects locates the material object as the nucleus of the production of the Americas, as a coherent and yet paradoxically heterogeneous subject. The object as an entity and a category forms the cornerstone of his scholarship as a whole. In his introduction to the Americas Revealed from 2018, he distills the importance of the object to its affective essence. He writes, "Objects take hold of the imagination. They represent other things, situations, and persons. They carry with them a multitude of associations regarding circumstances and places. Objects may be artifacts that elicit memories, or they may be relics of ownership," end quote. But equally important, if not more, is how that object is represented. In Language of Objects, he expands the definition of object to give rightful attention to the human body, and, more precisely, the representation of the colonized human bodies of the indigenous, African, Asian, and mestiza inhabitants of this so-called New World. How things are depicted is, in many ways, much more telling than the real form of the objects themselves. And so while Augier's still lifes of fruit do not directly represent the human subject, through Edward's analysis we can begin to perceive how they carry connotations of human labor, environmental exploitation, racialized hierarchies. When we behold Augier's plátanos amarillos dangling by a cord and exhibiting various stages of ripeness, we not only place them in conversation with earlier 17th century Spanish still lifes, which feature similarly suspended elements in a quiet monastic arrangement, but we are also attuned to the centrality of the plantain and the banana and other tropical commodities to the visual, economic, and racial regimes of the Caribbean in a broader global imaginary. Plátanos amarillos recalls the hanging fruits that we see in another work by Augier, which draws out these valences even more potently. And this is, of course, Augier's most celebrated painting, the monumental El Velorio, or the Wake. As my fellow panelists have attested, this canvas carries a tremendous affective impact due to its sheer size and compositional density. We see a baquiné, a raucous celebration of the life of a dead child, which derives from Congo practices and rituals. And here it takes place in a bohío, or a modest dwelling. There are 24 figures of various races and ethnicities who are engaged in activities ranging from singing and playing to, in the center, intense reverence for the child. And yet there is a tension to the scene that derives from its unresolved action, which grows more perplexing the longer that we look at it. A man at the extreme right grabs a machete from the wall, and at the extreme left another man pours a bottle of rum on another figure's head, who is embracing a woman. Edward likens El Velorio to contemporaneous naturalist paintings in France, which depicted realistic scenes of poverty and economic strife as a means of social critique, and a movement with which Augier surely would have been familiar due to his frequent trips to Paris during this period. Indeed, after being shown at the Ateneo Puertorriqueño in February 1894, El Velorio ultimately made its way to Europe, having been intended for exhibition at the Paris Salon of 1895. And yet, as Edward instructs us, we must not and cannot view this painting strictly from the vantage point of Europe. The content is so highly specific to Puerto Rico that, as he writes, it becomes, quote, an encyclopedia of sorts of the racial makeup of the country, from the black former slave to the white landowner, and including the mixed race inhabitants of the college, and the corrupt lower bourgeois priest and chaplain, end quote. El Velorio is so thoroughly the product of a transnational artist that any orthodox reading cannot do it justice. And so it gives the lie to the tired binary of center and periphery that artists like Augier defied by their very existence, and that Edward has spent a career interrogating. This, then, is the second claim that forms the heart of his scholarship. He is most drawn to artists whose personal and professional trajectories disregard, complicate, or confuse the limitations of place, particularly when it comes to defining that ever-slippery construct of Latin America. It is not simply a geographic interrogation. More profoundly, it is a methodological one, which places overlooked figures like Augier on equal footing with their European counterparts. This is a claim that is explicitly and powerfully outlined in the introduction to From San Juan to Paris and Back that I would like to read now. I do indeed wish to push back against a persistent perception upheld by reliance upon a now outmoded and unacceptable canon or hierarchy of aesthetic values that privileges certain artists and works within the history of 19th and early 20th century art. I do not wish to place Augier as an ancillary component of the larger conversation sustained by the realist, impressionists, or post-impressionists, mainly of French origin, but rather to situate his work and that of his contemporaries in the 19th century Caribbean front and center in the discourse of incipient modernity, a modernity that was often defined by strikingly different visual inflections than the work of artists elsewhere, and which followed a chronological or stylistic development that did not necessarily adhere to those of artistic centers across the Atlantic. The anxiety of influence looms large in the field of Latin American and Latinx art history, and it has the tendency to spur a defensive posture on the part of its proponents, who often advocate for legitimacy, but do so on normative terms. Edward's work on Auger lays out a thesis statement for the field in general, and it is one that he has imparted to his students. Do not remain enthralled to the genealogies of influence and causality. Instead, seek out lineage, reciprocal dialogue, mutual engagement. This, I think, is the greatest lesson of Edward's work with Auger and his scholarship more generally. It is ultimately a lesson that takes pedagogy and collaboration extremely seriously. It's telling that Edward devotes an entire chapter to Auger's depiction of La Escuela del Maestro Rafael Cordero. The work is a curious combination of genre painting and portraiture, showing a scene of the teacher, Rafael Cordero, who was a self-educated Afro-Puerto Rican who in 1810 established a free school for children regardless of race or socioeconomic standing. We see the teacher engaged in the process of instructing his students and perhaps trying to retain control of that classroom. And it's a specific form of labor that would have resonated with Auger. The artist himself was a committed pedagogue, having founded and administered several art academies during his lifetime. It is unclear whether Auger and Cordero ever actually crossed paths in their lifetimes, but there is an attention to lineage in this work that is underscored by Edward's analysis. The fact that he has dedicated this particular chapter to his mentor and colleague, Jonathan Brown, further attests to the importance of pedagogy, not as a companion to scholarship, but as a form of scholarship in its own right, scholarship in its purest and most substantial iteration. So I was given strict instructions before this to limit my remarks to Edward's research instead of his mentorships, and those are instructions that I am now going to blatantly disregard. Because to speak of Edward's scholarship strictly within the realm of material product is to tell an incomplete story. Every single one of the hallmarks of his research, his questioning of the limits of Latin America as a construct, his insistence on the object as a carrier of ideas and imaginaries, his dedication to uplifting underrepresented and marginalized voices, his truly peripatetic, wide-ranging curiosity. These are all lessons that he has imparted to those of us who are extremely fortunate enough to call ourselves his students. As a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts, I was privy to these lessons not only in the seminar room, but also in one-on-one conversations, in countless visits to museums, galleries, and private collections, in discussions with a student cohort of renegades who sought to challenge the geographic and disciplinary limitations of art history from within, and with Edward's blessing. I am of a generation that saw the mainstreaming of Latin American art into some of the most authoritative institutional hegemons in the United States. Edward was instrumental in that effort, and he gladly invited us along with him on that journey. In 2011, he co-curated an exhibition at the Gray Art Gallery that focused on another artist pedagogue, Esteban Vicente, whom we studied in seminar. The accompanying catalog to Concrete Improvisations emphasized Vicente's role as an instructor at Black Mountain College and beyond. And for this catalog, Edward conducted interviews with Vicente's former students, including Chuck Clothes and Dorothea Rockburn. He wrote that for Vicente, quote, his best thinking or creating derived from contact with others, yet he did not wish to impose his ideas. He would not instruct in the conventional sense, but rather suggest ways of thinking, end quote. Edward's pedagogy takes a similar approach, for it is grounded in a rigor that is matched only by his generosity. His work at the Institute of Fine Arts has been paramount to the development of the broader field, with the foundation of the Roberta and Richard Huber Colloquium on the Arts and Visual Culture of Spain and the Colonial Americas, the creation of the Latin American Forum, and the establishment of the annual Symposium of Latin American Art. The last of these initiatives began in 2016 as a friendly challenge to doctoral students at the time, myself included. We were offered the opportunity to develop programming to advance scholarship in the field, and it could take any form whatsoever as long as we were willing to organizing it. That is an astounding amount of trust to place in one's students. And the result 7 years later is an annual, multilingual international symposium dedicated to highlighting emerging scholars, and it's still entirely student organized. It is one of the proudest and most genuinely collaborative efforts of my graduate experience at the IFA. Indeed, the student-teacher relationship is central to Edward's larger scholarship, and it's one that receives its full due in his work. The first chapter, From San Juan to Paris and Back, begins, unusually for an academic text, with a personal recollection. He writes, "My first encounter with Auger was as a graduate student of art history reading Lynda Naucklin's book, Realism, in which she discussed the relationship of the Puerto Rican painter's most well-known canvas, The Wake, to images of death and burial by his teacher, Gustave Courbet. It's a frank and moving testimony to the power of our training to inflect our intellectual trajectories. And there is a beautiful analogical symmetry at work here, Courbet and Auger, Naucklin and Sullivan. I and my fellow alumni of the Institute of Fine Arts, and current students, I must add, are unbelievably privileged to be part of that lineage. With respect to my own scholarship, Edward has had an immeasurable impact. The Auger project, as I like to think about it, produced 2 formative graduate seminars that I took as his student. The first, Latin American Artists in Paris, radically expanded my understanding of what and where Latin America is. It was my first introduction to Auger, and it also marked the very beginning of my research on Jesus Soto and kinetic art. The Paris seminar is also how I was first introduced to Estrellita all those years ago, who was at work on a Soto exhibition at the Grey Art Gallery, with which I eventually assisted in very modest ways. The second was my final graduate seminar, Caribbean Art at the Crossroads of the World. That seminar was timed to coordinate with the exhibition of the same name that was held at the Studio Museum, the Queens Museum, and El Museo del Barrio, and it was decisive in promoting an understanding of what Edward calls the borderless Caribbean, and I double-checked the syllabus, that is the wording. This included not just the Greater and Lesser Antilles, but also cities such as New Orleans, Caracas, Cartagena, and, of course, New York. This was the seminar that seeded in my mind the conception of petroleum as an engine of Caribbean economies and imaginaries, a latter-day refined material that derives from a colonial history of extraction, including the sugar economy, which was a topic of substantial inquiry in that seminar, which included a considered look at Auger's depictions of sugar plantations like Hacienda La Fortuna. This was my own version of encountering the relationship between Auger and Courbet, and it led directly to the formulation of my dissertation topic and eventually my first book. So many of Edward's students are in this crowd, and it is indeed like a family reunion. He has changed the field of art history, not just in his writing, organizing, and tireless curating, but also in shaping and nurturing a generation of scholars to whom he has lovingly and generously passed the torch. He is the champion for all of us, conceiving of scholarship as an inherently collaborative, open-ended, collective practice, which is something we need much more of in this field. And so I must repeat, in quite literal terms this time, that the field of Latin American and Latinx art history as we know it simply would not exist without him, because we would not be here in this room. He is a model of generosity, of the humanity of art history, and of the relentless pursuit of an ethical, generative scholarship. For that, I and all of us say thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this evening. It's a pleasure to be here as we celebrate Edward together this afternoon. My presentation, titled Unplaceable Intimacies, Unimagined Horizons, may at first seem like a roundabout way to honor Edward's impact on our field. That is, it does not tap into his vast bibliography per se, and instead deals with a body of work that's been overlooked for quite some time. But it's in this spirit that I see this talk as very much an homage to our honoree. Working with Edward since arriving at the IFA 2 years ago has proven a constant reminder that it's not just okay, but necessary to venture into the lacuna of art history, to situate ourselves in areas that our disciplines long deemed off limits. Where for Edward, that looked like delving into the fullness of art in Latin America at a time when such a pursuit was quite unthinkable. In the case of the research I'll present, It's inspired a centering of trans subjects and genderqueer politics within our understanding of early 20th century art. Still, even this strain of thought is very much indebted to art historians like Edward, together with many others seated in this room, who have championed critical, feminist, and queer approaches within our field for decades. And it feels fitting to be able to recognize Edward's foregrounding and generous framing of women identifying and LGBTQ modernists here at CAA, where he helped to form the Gay and Lesbian Caucus in 1989, what lives on today as the Queer and Trans Caucus. While my talk represents research at an early stage, foreshadowing some of the topics I hope to develop into a dissertation, it's in these incipient moments where the example Edward has long modeled feels especially meaningful, an ethos of forging new paths while bringing others along with you. So thank you, Edward, for always holding the door open and for adding to a world of thought where the work I and so many others hope to do becomes possible and fostered in community. We're looking at a painting that has eluded scholarly attention for nearly a century. This large-scale portrait by the Mexican artist Naue Olin, to my knowledge, has never before been the subject of a single text or even mention. If you know otherwise, I would of course love to speak later. Completed in the late 1920s from Olin's rooftop home in Mexico City's historic center, the view from which recedes into a colorful vista, the painting centers on an anonymous, fabulous femme subject, albeit one rendered illegible for many decades. This work was first published in the catalog for a 1992 retrospective of Olin's work in Mexico City. At the time, it appeared with the title Hombre con bata de cera roja, or Man in Red Silk Robe. By the late 90s, it was sold by Andre Siegel, a noted collector of Olin's paintings, and purchased by patrons in California, whose holdings of works by women artists it belongs today. Under their custodianship, the portrait has borne the names Saturday Night Transvestite and the Mexican Transvestite in Red Dress. These titles, I want to suggest, tell us a great deal about the obfuscation of trans subjects within the writing of art history, their misgendering and mistranslation of gender-variant life in Mexico map on to both the permutations of language since the late 20th century and the painting's movement into a global North context, whose terms for queer genders and sexualities tend to eclipse those specific to other parts of the globe. In my rejection of these titles and proposal of an alternative, Travesti on the Rooftop, I seek to make an intervention whose goals are twofold. First, I aim to recuperate a subject whose specific trans feminine identity, what in Mexico, as I'll explain, aligns more closely with the category travesti, offers a rare aesthetic point of entry into the politics and history of dissident genders from 1920s Mexico. And second, I hope to articulate a framework that dwells in the specificities of genderqueerness beyond the US, allowing us to rethink received narratives of modern art through the prism of a specifically Latin American transfeminist theory. But first, a bit of context. When Naue Olin executed this painting, she was in the midst of a series of striking self-portraits in which pleasurable excess and blissful jouissance converse with the terrain of Mexico City. Following a split from the influential artist Dr. Atol, Olin was living alone in her rooftop home and beginning to take her artistic career and status as muse into her own hands. The portraits she created from the end of the 1920s are notable for many reasons, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm most interested in pointing us toward the spatial and sexual dynamics they encode, how the relation Olin thematizes between subject and backdrop troubles the accepted moral and gendered rubric of the post-revolutionary period. Let's consider, for example, this larger-than-life self-portrait, in which the artist depicts herself nude, poised at the very edge of her rooftop terrace. Her serpentine silhouette bisects the urban topography, which spills upward, unfurling into a perspectival bricolage. Olene envisions the cityscape enveloping her body, and at the same time pictures it as noticeably unpopulated. Its deserted streets and vacant patios leaving no trace of the capital's more than 1 million inhabitants at the time. These spatial distortions, however, are also met with a series of visual resonances that seek to situate Olene's erotic self-imagination within the space of the metropolis. Her curved contours, for example, reverberate with the peaks of the mountain range in the far distance. In the left half of the image, 2 adjacent church cupolas suggest a pair of nipples. This same red hue dances across the single-bloomed flower, the rouge of Olene's lips, and her painted fingernail in the upper right corner. There lies then a certain ambivalence in the ways the artist locates and also dislocates feminine exuberance within the capital, a desired, if contested, intimacy with a place that at the time relegated such euphoric expressions of gender to the illicit and profane. With these features in mind, we can begin to notice a distinct interplay between yet another unruly body in Mexico City and the artist's contemporaneous travesti on the rooftop. In comparison to the open expanse of the capital in Olene's self-portrait, interrupted only marginally by a slim balustrade, in her painting of a trans woman, this stylish subject poses before a blocky parapet wall. The opaque slab of mauve fills the lower half of the composition, leaving a much more shallow swath of urban terrain behind her. Where Olene's nude self-portrait transforms the city to accommodate a feminist fantasy, in this second work, the pictorial device of the wall scaffolds a sense of physical and psychological remove, of a body that to the artist's eyes could not fit neatly into the equation of the city. But what is it that sets this sitter apart from her surroundings? Unlike the ways nudity and erotic exuberance define Olene's self-representation, as in defiance of, yet still in dialogue with, the modern cityscape, in this work, the visual idiom of trans identity alone creates this tension. The signifiers of difference live solely on the surface of the body. Thinly arched eyebrows, the thick smear of lashes, and a matte red lip, a short hairstyle, broad shoulders, and flat chest, exposed by the plunging neckline of her vermilion silk dressing gown. However composed her demeanor, this errant subject, by virtue of her appearance and physicality alone, is portrayed at a distance from the world around her. The dissonance Olene intimates here is in many ways emblematic of a dominant national imaginary that saw trans citizens as incongruous with desired visions of Mexicanidad. From the early 20th century, the increasingly public nature of trans identity incited a need to cast gender queerness as easy to recognize, surveil, criminalize, and in many cases, punish. The scopic regimes of modernity were fundamental to such taxonomic systems of control. This can be seen in the infamous events of November 1901, when Mexico City police raided a dance attended by some 41 partygoers, approximately half of whom cross-dressed in feminine attire. Memorialized in media culture, including prints such as these by Posada, the discovery of a fluidly gendered demimonde served as the basis for a positivist pathologizing of queer social life. The incident contributed to the conflation of male homosexuality with effeminacy in 20th century Mexico, and yet its trans implications are often neglected in scholarly discussions. In the absence of the attendees' voices, who's to say that some of them, routinely described as gay men, did not carry trans self-understandings that lingered after the lights came up? In the decades that followed, journals and newspapers continued to peddle a narrative of transness as deceitful and delinquent in nature. To cite but one example, some of the only photographic traces of trans life we have from this period come from a group of images taken at a notorious Mexico City prison that circumscribe queer effeminacy and trans embodiment with carceral space. While further research is needed to understand precisely how these images circulated, they do come from an archive of prominent photojournalists. They relate in ways to visual typologies common among criminologists and sexologists that worked rather successfully to pathologize trans subjecthood. If modern visual culture emerged as a particularly effective tool for the state to demarcate trans identity and its supposedly corrupt nature, this history can also be understood in relation to the failings of spoken language to describe gender nonconformity in pellucid terms. For example, one Mexican journalist encountering a group of effeminate men and travestis in a state prison in 1933 disparaged these subjects as, quote, incongruent, incomprehensible beings who are neither women nor men. It would not be until the late 1970s that the Portuguese-derived term travesti entered the vernacular of Mexico City, gradually replacing such pejorative precursors as sexual inverts, men dressed as women, or the reductive misnomer homosexual. And this is where the issue of translation that I mentioned earlier comes in, where travesti lives on in large swaths of the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Americas as a proudly held marker of identity. Its presumed English complement, transvestite, what's currently used to title Olin's portrait, belongs to a distinct history of linguistic transmutation. Understood by many in the US as an epithet, a vestige of medicalized definitions of gender deviance, the term was absorbed first by transsexual, and beginning in the 80s, the more capacious transgender. For these reasons and others, I follow the scholar Brodsky, who has written that, quote, the tensions between trans and travesti as identificatory categories are often untranslatable. Travesti then offers a provocation to the terms of genderqueerness that dominate the West, connoting a regionally specific transfemininity, unconditioned by anatomical or medically alterable determinations. As theorists, including Marlene Ware and Malu Machuca-Rose have argued, travesti highlights an embodied refusal against not only available descriptors of sex and gender, but also of correct, virtuous citizenship. It's within this context of travesti as a lived experience of knowing dissidence that I seek to resituate Olin's portrait, entering it into a history otherwise obscured by its previous names. The work foregrounds a subject that the state long deemed incongruent, yet whose patent glamour and daytime presence refuse to disappear into the margins of visibility. At the same time, this painting asks questions that, I hope, further a lineage of queer and feminist thought that our honoree has long promoted. Questions about how we attend to such ways of feeling, being, and being seen that wondrously exceed the logic of national belonging. Thank you, and congratulations again, Edward.
So many thanks to my fabulous colleagues and fellow members of the Sullivan intellectual family for these talks, which I think have demonstrated the ways in which Edward's students have walked along the path that he has forged for us. And now, without further ado, I'd love to invite our honoree to the stage.
So I am very humbled and I'm very thrilled, and I want to address you all as my dear friends, my dear colleagues. I want to, of course, acknowledge my very dear and supportive husband, Clayton Kirking, and I feel as if, as many of you have said, yes, it is a sort of reunion of like-minded people, and I only can imagine that I might have given a little boost to all of this brilliant scholarship, and with my pedagogy, which has been my passion, my desire to link places that are far away geographically but not so far away in any other way, and I cannot express my gratitude more deeply to the College Art Association for having given me this honor. I was like totally freaked out when I got that. The email in November, I actually read the first sentence and then put it away for 2 days, and I thought, oh God, I don't deserve this. It's not me. But anyway, I'm not a person to bask in the limelight, but I am basking in your love and affection, which comes out in not only these very beautiful discussions of your own work and some words about mine, but also looking around to see the people that have enriched my life so much and will continue to do so. And I hope that I will play a role in enriching yours and in continuing our work and continuing our, as several people always remind me, la lucha continúa. And así es porque la lucha es una lucha espiritual e intelectual y estamos todos involucrados en esa lucha para, bueno, en pro de nuestras pasiones, en pro de nuestros intereses intelectuales, and we have to just keep that going and inspire our friends and our students and everyone else. So I couldn't possibly be more grateful, and thank you so much to each and every person. You all mean something very, very special to me, and I am eternally grateful for that. Thank you.
I also wanted to thank Clayton for the secret picture finding for me for my PowerPoint. I hope you didn't mind.
No, I'm delighted. Some
we're
better than others.
Yes. Oh, yeah? We're a little over time, but I think we have time for a couple of questions if anyone wanted to ask anything. There's a microphone in the back.
Actually, I have the feeling that being the professor and taking up that everything has been said, and it is past, and I'm very conscious of time all the time in my classes. It's 10 after 6, so not to take hold of the proceedings, but I would like to let you go and distribute, talk among yourselves and reunite, and I will simply revel in this happiness of being in your presence. So I mean, if you want to ask me anything, that's fine, but I think that you've all said it all. Words fail me. So anyway, thank you for being here.
Thank you.